This interview is with Francis Morton on the 5th of May 2022 in London.
Hello, my name's Francis Morton. I was born in London in 1952, and to my parents, George and Renee Morton, both of whom were Jewish Czech refugees who escaped from Europe before and during the war. When I grew up, I knew that my family were Jewish, but religion didn't come into it. My parents were, if anything, against it, but they knew their identities. And so I grew up without having that sort of background. But there's no question of who they were. They didn't try to conceal that. Equally, they never wanted, certainly when I was young, to talk about what happened to their families. And it was a long time till I actually found out what happened, probably in my 20s or older. And so it became almost a voyage of discovery.
At that point, could we go back slightly to your parents, and if you could say how they came and exactly when, and what their experiences were that brought them to England.
Yeah. Okay.
And something about your grandparents.
Right. Taking my mother's story at first, she was born in 1919 in Pilsen in what is now Czech Republic. But when she was young, her family moved to Prague, where she lived in a large flat with her parents, older sister, and widowed grandmother. In 1938, when she was 18, her parents, my grandparents, were getting more concerned with what was going on over the border in Germany and in Austria, and with Hitler's threats to take over the Sudetenland, the bit in Czech Republic nearest to Germany. And they decided the best thing they could do would be to help Renee, my mother, get to somewhere safer. They managed to get her a domestic service visa, and in September 1938 she made her way by train, by boat, to a family in England, in Cambridge.
And what was her maiden name?
Her maiden name was Stransky. And her parents, her father worked in a bank processing overseas documents, and her mother stayed at home. And they were Jewish, but not strongly so. I gather my mother's grandmother lit candles on Friday night, but that was possibly about the limit of it, although I think a large number of their circle were Jewish, and I doubt that was a coincidence. Anyway, my mother, Renee, came to England, as I said, in 1938, and had stayed she didn't actually like very much where she was staying at first. She moved to the David Eder farm, which is a Jewish farm on the south coast, and eventually she managed to persuade the Czech authorities in exile to sponsor her going to university. So she went to St Andrews University in Scotland to read biochemistry. Now I'm thinking, my father came from a slightly more observant background, but he was also not very interested in that. He was a year older. He was born in 1918 in Brno, which is in Moravia, part of the Czech Republic. My parents were teenagers when they parted in 1938, but they were boyfriend and girlfriend who knew each other from Jewish summer camps. My father was stuck in Czechoslovakia, when the Germans occupied the whole country and had to figure out what to do. He feared an explosion and didn't want to stay there. So he decided the best thing he could do would be to illegally emigrate to what was then the British Mandate of Palestine. So with the help, I think, of the Jewish Agency, he made his way to Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia, where the Slovak authorities locked him and other would-be emigrants up, I think for about 6 months or so.
Because Slovakia had sided with Germany.
That's correct.
Yes.
It wasn't occupied, but it was under the control of Germany. And eventually the Slovak authorities did allow the immigrants who'd been locked up to get away. I suspect there was a lot of bribery involved, but I've not read that anywhere. So he boarded a paddle ship that went down the Danube through various countries and came out on the Black Sea at the Romanian port of Tulcea, where he boarded a larger ship. This ship, the SS Atlantic, set off for Palestine, but they got as far as the Mediterranean, but they'd suffered from an outbreak of typhus which killed a number of people. They ran out of food, they ran out of water, and they eventually ran out of fuel. And they went round finding all the wood that could be burnt from cabins or bunk beds, and even the masts of the ship. But in the end, they were drifting helplessly in the Mediterranean. Luckily, a British warship spotted them, towed them into Limassol harbour in Cyprus, where they were refuelled and escorted by the British, went across to Haifa, which is now in modern-day Israel. But because immigration to Palestine was illegal, they were locked up by the British, put on another ship and sent to Mauritius, where they were interned. And it looked like a prison camp. I've seen photographs of the men's quarters. And eventually, some 15 months later, my father George got out by volunteering to join the Czech part of the British Armed Forces. So he boarded a ship which went via South Africa and eventually turned up in England. That's how he got there. His family background, as I said earlier, his parents were a little bit more religious, but not really so. So they're more interested actually in emigrating to what they hope would be the Jewish state in Palestine. Anyway, when my parents got to England, when they eventually met up after several years apart, they got married in May 1943. Right. After the war, my mother became a research scientist and my father became a statistician working at the LSE. And my older brother, Philip, was born, he's 3.5 years older than me. He was born in 1949. And eventually, despite everything, my parents weren't happy together. My father moved to Switzerland, where he accepted a post at the University of Constance, in Germany, in fact, but living in Switzerland, and had a second family. So I've got a whole bunch of, I have a stepmother in Switzerland and 4 half-siblings who I see from time to time.
How did you feel about that at the time
when my
your
parents
split up?
I was very upset. I was 8 at the time. I hadn't seen it coming, although in hindsight it was obvious that it ought to happen. And I felt a I felt a lot of sympathy for my mother. I mean, she'd lost her family, and then she didn't have a family of her own. Now, talking about my family in England, as I say, I was born in London. I went to school in London, went to university in England.
Which university did you go to? Which school?
Cambridge. I went to, actually it's a traditional immigrant route from St Paul's School to Trinity Cambridge. A lot of people did that. Westminster was too Christian, I'm afraid. Because, you see, religion didn't impinge on my home life, but I always knew who I was. It's just we tended to keep fairly quiet about it.
Why did you feel that it was necessary, or was it just an understanding that one didn't speak about it? Was it an element of fear from the past?
I suspect it came from my parents' attitude. It just, you didn't talk about it, you didn't mention it. It just also happened that a lot of my friends had followed a similar route. And I didn't really think about it too much until in the 1990s, how old was I then, in my 30s, I attended for the first time a second generation conference, and I came across a lot of other people with similar experiences. And it became clearer to me, either refugees spoke obsessively to their children about it, or else they didn't say anything. And that was my case. When I asked my mother about that, she said, well, didn't want to trouble you with it, and we were more focused on setting up a new life, on moving forward, rather than looking back. But I think there's more to it than that, actually. I mean, she'd managed to get out, her parents saved her, but her older sister didn't escape, and nor did any of the rest of the family. So there was this gap in my history that I was always aware of without really knowing much more than that. What actually I did do is, when my mother moved, when she downsized to a flat, I found a box full of letters. They were letters that she kept, because she always kept stuff. She never threw anything away. I don't know if that's someone living through the war or refugee mentality. But there were about 500 or so letters written to my mother between 1938 and about 1946. Most of them were in German, because that was her mother tongue. But a lot of them were in Czech and some in English. And I actually took some years, because I was working at the time, to get them translated. And then, by the time I got my hands on the box of letters, my mother had died and was no longer able to answer any questions. So I could find out a certain amount, but I couldn't fill in the gaps.
Did that trouble you a lot? Did you feel a great sense of loss that you couldn't fill the gap and you couldn't answer all your questions or get your questions answered by her?
I thought it was a shame, but I think over the years and more recently, I think the sense of loss is quite different. It's to do with a loss of the heritage that I should have had, because although, as I said, my family weren't strongly religious, I think my mother always described her family as culturally Jewish. And if I think of my mother, I think of her sitting down, reading a book in one of several languages, and in particular listening to Schubert and other such 19th century music.
That's a lovely memory.
It is, but it's also, it's a bit sad, because I feel that should have been mine. In fact, since I retired, I gave up work some 3 years ago or so, I actually find that I'm listening much more to European music, to classical music, and taking courses on it and so forth. Sort of thing my mother would have been very pleased about had she known, but that's just family background. I think looking at... Sorry, I'll carry on with my mother's stuff. I mean, she lived in London really for the rest of her life. She travelled quite a lot, and in fact, I remember when I was a teenager, she and I went on a holiday to Austria, to the Tyrol, and she didn't have a problem going back. She wasn't hostile towards Germans or Austrians, as I think she could have been. You know, that she didn't have that sort of bitterness. And my father much the same.
So did that influence your attitude towards Germany and German people?
Yes, to an extent. I mean, when I first found out what happened during the war, I was actually quite angry about it, and hostile to things German, but that didn't last long at all. And particularly if I thought if my parents can live with it.
Well, you say when you first found out, when was that roughly, would you say?
It was more of a gradual process because my mother said, when I asked what happened to the rest of the family, she said they died in the war. That's when I was a child. And that didn't, that was said in a way that I wasn't supposed to ask anything more, just it's a fact. And it was only gradually later, little anecdotes crept in. I think my mother's older sister stole 2 onions and was locked up for 3 days because of that. Little snippets here and there. But she wasn't bitter towards Germans and Austrians. And I think that helped her. In fact, think about it. And Czechs, there was no problem with anyway. But you can say her older sister, Ilse, married Peter Keane, who some people may know wrote the libretto for Der Kaiser von Atlantis, an opera written in Terezin. And why was I talking about that? Can't remember.
It'll come back to you.
Possibly.
About not being bitter.
Yes.
But after the war, it must have hit her tremendously to find when she went back to Czechoslovakia that there was no one left.
I think it must have done. The only survivor from her family was her uncle who escaped to the United States, and a cousin who survived the camps, and one aunt who also came to England. But all the rest were murdered during the war.
Do you know where they went, where they were sent to?
Yes. Actually, before I do that, I'll come back to... No. Okay, sorry, I know where they were sent to. They were sent... 3 of my 4 grandparents, both my mother's parents and my father's father, were all sent from their hometowns, from Prague or from Brno, to Terezin. And in 1944, they were sent to Auschwitz in October 1944 on almost the very last trains from Terezin to Auschwitz, where they were murdered. I know why I wanted to talk about Peter Keane is he was a young, up-and-coming artist, as well as being a librettist and a poet. And my mother had never been back to Czechoslovakia since she left in 1938 until 1988, still when Czechoslovakia was under Soviet control. But there was an exhibition of Peter Keen's artwork in the small fortress in Terezin. And she was so keen to see that my mother made the trip to Czechoslovakia. And that was the first time in 50 years she'd been back to her homeland. And I went with her for two reasons. One is she didn't really want to go on her own. And the other is it gave her a chance to show me something of where she lived as a child. Because she'd left when she was 18, as I said, and frankly, from current perspective, she was still a child when she went. Except she wasn't on the Kindertransport, she was too old for that. So anyway, we went to Prague, and she was able to show me around, saying, oh, that's where I had piano lessons, or that's where I had tea with Mother. And it sort of brought it back to life for her. And we went to Terezin, which I don't know if you've been there. It's a fairly grim town. And we saw a lot of the artwork there. There were oil paintings of my mother's mother and her sister, Peter Keen's wife, and sketches of others and so on. But they're all still in Terezin, this artwork. And I know it's probably not in camera shot, but I think the only piece of Peter Keen's artwork not there is this portrait of my grandmother, which is hanging on the wall behind me.
Which can be photographed later.
Okay.
So that's tremendous. That's an important link for you.
It
Do you
is.
treasure it?
I do, and it's of a middle-aged woman thoughtfully looking down, and I think of her sometimes as looking over my shoulder or looking at me. But that's whimsical.
As a child or as a very young person, were you aware of a gap in terms of a family and miss having aunts, uncles, grandparents around you, or even to see from time to time like other children?
Very much so. It's a very acute point. Because, I used to be very envious of friends who were grumbling that they had to go and see their grandparents. Because I would have loved to have had grandparents. Yes, I grew up not having any of those, any uncles or aunts or cousins, or anything much spoken about family or when my parents were growing up. Yeah, that was a great loss. But I don't know what I would have done in those sort of circumstances. Would I have shut it away or not? I don't blame my parents for that.
Did you think that it was very hard for your mother ultimately to be on her own, and in terms of bringing you up and managing and coping?
I think she just got on with it. Yes, I do think it was hard. If you stand back from it, you would say that is it's very difficult as a single parent living in a country. Yes, I mean she spoke flawless English, but she didn't have any support network.
Yeah.
And she wasn't actually close to that many people. The people she was really close to were fellow Czech Jewish emigrants to England. And I think she kept a barrier between herself and others. And I've thought if I were in that position, if anything went wrong, there wouldn't be many people to turn to. Maybe it was epitomised actually by one thing. You see, for her and my father, education was paramount. A friend of mine said once, it's the one thing they can't take away from you. So that's where where their efforts went in, because you can then, even if all material possessions aren't there, you can make another start.
Yeah.
And I think at the time when I was transferring from prep school to St Paul's, I think we didn't have very much money, and she basically said, if you don't get a scholarship, well, my father wasn't necessarily prepared to pay that. She would have gone to some relatives and said, please, can I have the money? This aunt of hers who survived, she didn't want to do that. She didn't, in the end, need to do that, but it was a measure of how strongly she was motivated by education to do that.
Absolutely, because it was a lifeline to a new life for the children, that very often, if the parents were forced to take on menial work, whatever their qualifications, perhaps because of the language, they wanted their children to have the opportunities and a better life.
I also wonder whether it isn't also a refugee has mentally got a suitcase packed, so it's always transferable. I'll talk a bit later on my father's side, but I know far less about that. I'm not mother obsessed.
In terms of your home life, how European was it? How Czech or German do you feel, looking back, was it?
I think as a child, you're not really conscious of that at all. You don't compare with, this is the way your life is compared with what it might have been. I think with hindsight, as an adult, say, yes, the emphasis was on much the same as my mother's had been when she was younger. Theatres, operas, concerts, reading. It was unthinkable not to undertake those sorts of things. Now as someone younger, as a teenager or someone in their 20s, you go to, should we say, not classical music. You get engaged in current culture in the 60s, the 70s. That was unintelligible to my mother. But yes, I think the environment was a recreation to some extent of a Central European environment.
Did that include food?
To an extent. The dishes she cooked, some of them were European goulash or stuffed peppers and so on. But she was not a good cook. She wasn't interested in it. So a lot of it was just, I'll see what I can find and cook it.
May I tell you this interesting thing that she told me when I interviewed her, that when she was in domestic service, she had no idea how to cook, though she was required to when the cook was had a day off. And she recounted to me with great humour how she managed to cook fish on one side, burnt, and raw on the other side. And the family that she was with then decided that when the cook was away, a boiled egg with the timer at the side would work much better.
Yeah.
And she took great delight in telling me that. Yes.
Yes, she had no aspirations to be a cook.
No.
But the things
she was a scientist.
That's exactly right. And it's funny, when she came to England, she had to go into domestic service. There was no choice. That's how she got a visa.
Yeah.
Because the British only issued, I think, some 20,000 or so domestic service visas. And they didn't issue visas for anyone else to come in. And frankly, it sounds all too topical nowadays, seeing what's going on.
Yeah.
But she'd never done that. They were a middle-class family in Czechoslovakia. but they had a cook, so she didn't need to learn that, and they had a maid who cleaned. But suddenly, from that environment, she wasn't able to do what she had been doing, concerts, theatres, whatever. But she had to learn how to be a domestic servant. She had no interest in it, of course, and she was never, ever any good at it.
You mentioned a little earlier about possessions. If you went, say, to a school chum's home at some point, were you aware of differences in what people possessed and their furniture, whatever, in their homes? Or was your mother able to build up a home for you?
Oh, she built.
Compared with.
Yeah, she built up a home, and I mean, looking again with hindsight, I mean, it was large, heavy furniture. I mean, I wouldn't have thought it was particularly European rather than British. No, I don't think I
No, but in terms of quantity and so on.
No, the only thing I can recall noticing is our house was full of books. Bookshelves everywhere, books falling everywhere. And not everyone's house was. And for me, those houses didn't look complete. Comparing furniture and how they fitted, no. Except ours was mostly cold. She did put central heating in the 60s, but she didn't believe in having it on even until the frost was freezing on the windows.
Oh.
That's also an economic thing because she was tight for money for a while.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. There's something else in the 60s that I'm not quite sure how it happened, but someone or other who knew her parents got in touch with her. I think it was to do with the gradual liberalisation in Czechoslovakia, but it was before '68 and the Velvet Revolution. Someone eventually tracked her down and said, "I've got some possessions of your parents." And eventually, that's right, that's what turned up at her house was her parents' best china. I think it was her mother's wedding gift from her family of China. Her uncle's Queen Anne bureau, and one or two other things. Not many, but it just turned up out of the blue as far as I could see.
Was she very excited or shocked? What was her reaction? Do you recall? I know it was a long time ago.
Yeah, I think she was excited at first, but she wasn't a very material sort of person. She wasn't really interested in possessions. Yeah, so no, I don't think I noticed anything. No.
And your father?
Yeah. Well, he grew up, as I said, in Brno. I think he was born when his mother was 21 or so, which is quite a lot different. I think his father was a solicitor in Brno, middle class and respectable. His parents divorced when he was fairly young, and he had a half-brother. Half-brother actually did escape to Canada. He was taken by uncle and aunt of his, because in fact my father's parents, as well as his stepmother, were all murdered during the war. I said before, his father went to Terezin, where he was locked up for some years in the same way as my mother's parents, and was sent to Auschwitz. But George's mother, who'd remarried, was sent to Riga and was murdered there instead. He didn't have a happy childhood. I think his father was fairly strict, and his father remarried, and he hated his stepmother. And he said, and I thought he was joking at first, that his stepmother became a concentration camp guard. But I think he really disliked her so much, and that's what he said.
That was his comparison. Yeah.
But it may also have been true,
Mm.
actually. So there was a cold home life, whereas my mother's was much warmer.
Did that reflect on you as a child? Did you feel that there wasn't that warmth, or did you feel close to him as a child?
Not particularly close to him. He travelled quite a bit. He worked in the university. He was at the LSE for quite a lot of years. Mm. And he went off to India, I know, for several months. And he told me when he came back from India, I think I was about 6 or 7, I expressed some surprise. "Oh, your ship didn't sink then." He thought that was very funny. It was just a matter of fact, noticing, here you are.
Yes.
So maybe that reflects on it. I mean, we got closer later on, I think. He was fanatical about playing bridge, and that's one of the things I do, so we bonded over that. Mm. But eventually, in 1970, he accepted a chair at the University of Constance, which is actually on the German side of the Swiss-German border. And he was quite happy working there, but he didn't want to live in Germany. He lived on the Swiss side, which he was allowed to do. He also said he had no problem whatsoever with the young Germans. He didn't want. Sometimes when he met Germans of his age and older, he wondered, what did you do in the war? It was always at the back of his mind. But, he socialised with them. Yeah. I mean, he was Jewish. He had a bar mitzvah when he was 13, but wasn't really engaged with that.
Did you have a bar mitzvah?
No. No, it was... my mother was fairly ignorant about it. My father didn't want to go down that route. Which is why it's quite strange, because my wife is Jewish. Her family came over to England around the turn of the century, so a couple of generations before, from Eastern Europe.
Which part?
All I know is the region is called Kamenets-Podolsk, which is apparently quite a big one. It's on the Russian or the Polish borders. I mean, the borders changed anyway.
Yes, indeed.
And Jewish adherents to them also changed. They were mobile. So I don't know. She doesn't know either. But, I mean, there's a curious re-engagement, because from having had no involvement with that, now had more involvement since marrying and since having children. Which is a sense of belonging. I'm not necessarily religious, or delete the word necessarily, but there is a sense of community which I never had when growing up. My parents were very isolated. Well, they're isolated people. They're very much separate, whereas actually having a more stable environment since getting married made a big difference.
That's really interesting, because I was going to ask you if you and your mother or father had ever gone, for example, to what's now the Czech and Slovak club in West End Lane, but used to be the Czechoslovak, called the Czechoslovak House, a club. They used to have dances and special events and commemorations, and still do to some extent. But that's where the Czechoslovak community congregated primarily, not necessarily Jewish, but in general.
No, as far as I'm aware, they never went there. My father didn't like Slovaks. I mean, they'd locked him up for 6 months, so that didn't endear them to him. So, no. Curiously, my father, when he was very old, when he was in Switzerland, sort of had a certain amount of, I suppose, reversion to his roots. He did actually go to synagogue once or twice, and then decided again he didn't want to be there, so he didn't go again. I know there's one anecdote, by the way. I mentioned in 1988 my mother went back with me. Thereafter she was able to go without me. It had broken the dam, so she could actually go. And she discovered that native Czechs got a reduction in the hotels at the time. So she demanded her Czech passport back, saying she hadn't left it had left her. And she became a Czech citizen again. Since Brexit, interestingly, I was so furious about that I went and got Czech citizenship as well.
Do you think she would have been pleased?
She would have been amused, I think. And she didn't feel strongly Czech, but she did have some association with the country. So anyway, I've now got Czech citizenship, and so have 2 of my children. So rekindling that sort of link.
I'd like to follow that up with how you brought up your children and whether you spoke about your family background to the children and whether they were interested or are interested today. And did they know that they were Jewish?
Yes, they did. I mean, they knew absolutely that's what they were. They all had their bar or bat mitzvahs. They went to a Jewish primary school, to a Kiva school. And interestingly, the one exercise that one of the primary school teachers did was to get the children to interview their grandparents and draw up a family tree. And that for me was very interesting because that meant my older daughter interviewed my mother, and there's a family tree that is fairly useful in terms of some of the work that I've been doing since, as well as just knowing what happened. And yes, so they always knew who they were, and they also knew gradually what happened during the war. I mean, I'm not sure how one introduces children of any sort, I mean any religion or race, to the Holocaust, let alone introducing Jewish children to that.
Did you ever encounter any anti-Semitism at school or at university?
I didn't. I think my older brother did at a primary school. I don't know if that's a reason why he was then moved to prep school, which was a rather more sheltered environment, and was in Swiss Cottage, so it was very much in a Jewish area. No, I didn't.
And your children, do they feel comfortable with their Jewish background?
Yes, it's what they are. I don't think they're... well, they haven't told me that they've got any problems with that.
And have you taken them to what's now the Czech Republic? Or have they expressed an interest to go? Or
I haven't taken them, certainly, but excuse me, I'd like to do that, well, particularly to Prague and to Terezin. No, they I think some are more interested than others. Some have got young children, so they're rather more taken up with that. But it's interesting. One of my half sisters, who lives in Switzerland, is in the process of establishing her Czech citizenship, and is intending to go to Czech Republic this summer. I mean, my father, came from Brno. Her mother is Austrian. But so we thought we might meet up in Czechoslovakia this summer, which would be nice because I know quite a lot more. I've been back to Czech Republic a number of times since that first visit.
I was going to ask you about that, but I was going to also ask about your own career and going to Cambridge, and did you feel an outsider there, and then to move on to your own talks as a second generation person. But what was your subject? What did you read?
Mathematics.
At Cambridge?
I read maths then. Or I read punting on the river and drinking and so on, and not very much work. It was.
And were you encouraged to study by your parents to go on to higher education?
It was more than that. It was just. It was a no-brainer. There was no question that that's what would happen.
Yeah.
And I guess by the time I got to university, that's really the first time your path isn't mapped out, and I became less interested in studying. I mean, I became very interested in my career subsequent to Cambridge, but at Cambridge I was probably not the world's best student.
And what did you then proceed to do in terms of a profession?
I worked in IT. Now, I graduated in 1973, and IT at that time was in its infancy, really. And so I worked as a computer programmer, but was more interested ultimately in not how the technology works, but what you can do with the technology. And so from living in the sticks, living in Berkshire somewhere, I moved back to London and got much more involved with commercial computing, and eventually became a management consultant specialising in IT and technology for one of the big firms in the city. And that's very interesting. You see, I think it's more than theorise. I think if you're a consultant, you're on the outside, and that suited my personality, I think. As opposed to towing the company line and being within the company and living there from cradle to grave almost. And eventually I ended up with. I moved out of that because the risk of being sent to God knows where for several months at a time when I had a young family growing up didn't suit what I wanted to be doing. So I eventually worked in the city. It was around the time of Big Bang when there was, there were a lot of demand and very good salaries. So in effect, I worked for probably the last 25 years of my career in the city with investment banks and other, again, looking at the systems rather than looking at the banking side of it. But you couldn't not do that. And as I say, I think that did very well, and it also meant that I could eventually retire and do other stuff.
You mentioned time spent with your children and bringing them up. how important is family life to you now, especially as your parents had split?
It's very important. It's an interesting question how you address it, because how can family not be important? But it's how much you engage with them or don't. And I think having 4 children and currently 5 grandchildren, there's quite a lot of scope for involvement. But it's also nice to get your space back again. That's why I hesitate. So it's lovely seeing them, and it's lovely when they go away. But it's actually creating a family that I didn't have. That's where I look at it.
I wondered.
It's particularly having children of my own and having a normal background and 2 parents. And actually, although I was working hard, I did actually see them from time to time, rather than being a distant father.
I was going to ask you, did you make perhaps not a conscious effort to be a father that was around and not an absentee father?
I don't know if it's conscious, actually. It's probably more subconscious. But it's also nice. As I said, I gave up work about 3 years ago, and it's left more time for being with grandchildren. So it's almost, I think what I'm most conscious of is the grandparent-grandchild relationship, which I'd never observed from that of either participant. Yes, when my kids were young, they saw their grandparents. They saw 3 of the 4 quite frequently and were very close to them. But I was sort of in the middle as a parent. Now I can see the grandparent-grandchild relationship from the point of view of a certain detachment, and it's a lovely thing. And in a sense, it makes me feel angry to an extent that that's what was taken away from me. I'm sure my grandparents would have liked to have met me. My grandparents were aged about 60 when they died, and that's not very old. And I was born 8 years after that, so yes, they would have been around almost certainly. And I miss that theoretically I miss that. In practice, you only have one life, and that's the one you live.
The life you lead now, you've retired and you give talks about your life and your background. How did you come into that? Was it gradual, or was there a specific event that led you to this, and researching perhaps into your own family and Checo generally?
It was a combination, actually. Firstly, those letters that I found, it wasn't really till I eased off from full-time work, which took place over a number of years, that I had the time to see what it was that I'd got. It didn't seem right just to chuck them on a skip or put them away and ignore them, which is virtually the same thing. And so my oldest son is a linguist, and he was at Oxford, and through him I managed to get hold of someone who wanted to earn a bit of extra money by translating them. And that was well worth doing. She did a very good job in what was not an easy task, because the letters were quite often hard to decipher. They were written in Sütterlin, which is a particular style of German writing. And it took me several years to actually uncover what was in the letters, and also to assemble them in date sequence and who's written what. I'll come back to a point there about Peter Keane as well, which may or may not sound run. But anyway, it took me several years to get them translated. And I was sitting with them. I also tried to fill in the gaps and get the story consistent. And eventually a friend of mine, who's a journalist, wrote an article based on that, which he got published in the Daily Telegraph. And that set me thinking, if I could persuade him to write a book based on the letters, that would be good. Except he was busy doing other things, so that didn't happen. But I was persuaded to give a talk at Czech Scroll Day at Finchley Reformed Synagogue. Because they have a scroll taken from Czechoslovakia, which there's a library there which lends them out to various synagogues, so they're reused. And it was on the day of the Czech Scroll commemoration for them. And in the audience was one of the key people of Generation to Generation. And she said, "Aha, you might be interested in becoming a speaker." And that's actually what happened.
Which year was this?
Which year?
Or roughly?
Probably about 3-4 years ago. Sorry, you have to add a couple of years for COVID, probably about 5 or 6. But it took me probably a year or more to get the story straight, so it's coherent, it's pitched at the right level, it's deliverable over Zoom, which is not that easy. But that's what I do now with the information I got from that, tell my parents' stories. I tend not to bring myself into it much because it's about people in the Holocaust rather than second generation. But that feels to me like a very worthwhile thing to be doing. And again, it brings me back to some comment I made earlier. The pattern is repeating itself. You know, you've got people fleeing for whatever reason, taking dangerous journeys. My father's journey was particularly dangerous. And are generally not welcomed by the receiving countries. And that we're seeing nowadays.
Indeed.
So, which is why one thing that we have done is put our names forward to say we are interested in having Ukrainians stay here.
Because you understand and you sympathise.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, again, I think, why did I say I would come back to that? You were talking about the letters.
And what prompted you to give the talks? That's what we were looking at.
Well, that is very much, as I say, I mean, the first generation are virtually no longer with us. There's a lot of fake news, misinformation, and so on. It seems very important to speak out to counter that. And although it's, to my eyes, it's only a small thing, to give talks like this, I hope has influence on young people in particular.
Yes.
To say, this isn't fake news, this really did happen, and it happened on the scale as well. It wasn't just a few people were murdered.
Which groups do you speak to? Do you go into the schools, or is it higher education or school children?
It's a mixture, actually. I think the most recent one I did was to a sixth form Catholic college, and I spoke, I think, to about 180 students there. And the head of religious studies said you could have heard a pin drop, and that's not normal for these kids. So
that says a lot.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think
Did
so.
they ask a lot of questions?
No, it's exam time now, and they were short of time, so no, but the feedback was positive.
Good.
There's another one I gave over Zoom to Winchester Cathedral.
Mm.
You know, it's wherever you can get speaking slots, and I think G2G do a very good job in drumming those up.
Mm.
Anyway, so there are a number of mixed ones. I'm due to give one in a synagogue in July. So I think it's of interest, and the stories are worth telling. So the audience matters less. I mean,
When you go to the synagogues, particularly when, for example, the Czech Scroll Memorial Day, do you feel a special link with the place? Because some of those Czech scrolls I know came from the synagogue opposite the Knightsbridge Barracks.
is that the west? There's one in the middle there. They're all stored there. I think that's where the organisation is who loan them out. No, I don't think I feel a particular connection with those. I mean, I'm pleased that they're being reused. It feels like they didn't win. So
Because the really badly damaged ones are supposed to be buried, aren't they? Rather than reused. But there is a strong feeling, I know, that it's good that they're being used.
yeah, I mean, I take that. It is good that they're, well, not living things, but in one sense.
Yes, that there's this continuity.
Yes. And I suppose learning more about it, I mean, over the years, you know, the scrolls are important, but they're portable as well. So as Jewish communities have to move over, in history have had to move quite frequently. Yeah. What can you take? Well, a scroll is rather more portable than goods or land or anything else.
Yes.
So I quite like that sense of continuity.
It's important.
And I don't know, there is always the feeling of you may have to move again.
Does that linger with you?
Yes, actually I think it does. You know, I think my parents would when they were growing up wouldn't necessarily have thought that they might have to move, but it happened. Since I know what happened to them and their families, yes, it is there in the background.
Has that increased over the years with especially latterly, with the anti-Semitism in Britain? Or is it part of your DNA, so to speak?
I think that more than anything. Yes, I think that is in the background there, and maybe there's nothing you can do about it now. That's, I think, why it is very important for people of all races and religions to know something of their history so they can carry it forward.
Do you think your children have that sense of we might need to move that you have, that your parents had? Or do you think because they were born here, they've grown up here, they feel more secure somehow?
I haven't asked that many of them, but I know one of them, my oldest son, is where he's in the United States because that's where he could get a job, and also sees himself almost as an outpost if we had to move. And I've heard of third generation. Well, syndrome is overstating, but in the same way as second generation has been affected, and I know that I have. it also goes down to the next generation. And that for me says, that's an example of it. Yeah. Whereas the others, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I suspect deep down it's there.
Yes.
Yeah. But I mean, that's what's happened to Jewish people and to non-Jewish people. They can be living in some place for generations, hundreds of years, and be forced to get up and flee. And I suppose you want to retain the flexibility to be able to do that if it's your turn.
Yeah. In terms of today, what do you feel is your identity? Is it English or Czech or a combination?
It's not Czech. I like having a Czech passport. That gets me through the queues at Dover rather more quickly. I think I wouldn't say English either, because English has connotations of people with large bellies flying flags of Cross of St George. I'd say British, if anything. I feel part of that, but also probably more Jewish than when I was growing up. Then it was just more being apart or separate, or so this is rather more identity.
Is that comforting?
Yes.
Or does it bring internal conflicts?
No, it doesn't. There are no conflicts. It means I can be as annoyed as I always was about the sort of right-wing nationalism and way of looking at, what would you say, English exceptionalism.
It's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. I think of Boris Johnson there, but don't get me started on that.
Is there anything that you would like to go back to or enlarge upon? Or that has come to mind latterly?
I'm just reflecting on that. No, I'm not sure if there are any gaps there that you would like me to try to fill in. That's the way of throwing it back to you, you see.
That's fine.
No, I mean, I suppose that having learned far more about my background, it provides a sense of both anger that's been taken away, but also now I know more about it, I become more at ease with myself to know, rather than just knowing there's something there and not knowing what that something was.
You know who you are.
Yes.
Yes.
And I'm not unhappy about that. Actually, I was going to refer to something else that doesn't quite fit in this part of the sequence, but
That's fine.
it was about 15 years ago or so. We took a road trip from England across Europe. I think so. Drove from here across the Channel, went to through Germany, and got as far as Pilsen in the west of Czech Republic, which is where my mother was born. And had a look around the town there, and then drove further round to Česká Lípa, which is where my grandfather was born and came from, and eventually drove round to Poland, to Krakow, where I discovered a lot of my father's family had come from. And that was fascinating. That's partly as a tourist, partly looking for vestiges of Jewish life. I mean, there were memorials in Germany we went through Worms, for example. There's a whole lot there. There's some rabbi or other came from there. Krakow is a very Jewish town, Kazimierz, adjacent to Krakow or part of it. And then eventually that's just very near to Auschwitz. So I made the one and only trip that I've ever done to Auschwitz. I don't feel a need to repeat it, but I did know that I would intend to go there at some point. And then we carried on. We drove through the Tatras, the mountains my mother always referred to in Czech Republic, through Slovakia, through Brno. And again, it was very much a voyage almost of discovery, but there wasn't a lot to discover. And that took well over 2 weeks to do that, but it was worth doing.
When you say we, did you mean your wife and all your children, or
No.
some of them?
Just the two of us. No. They had their own lives.
And did at the end of the trip, or when you were reflecting afterwards, did it make you feel more whole?
It did fill out the picture rather more. This is where my family came from.
And these are your roots, and you
Yes.
yes.
I mean, I don't feel a desire to go and live in any of those countries, but I'm comfortable going to visit them. And so I would quite like the chance to show my sister around, because I know a lot more about it. In fact, that's one of the strange things. You remember I spoke about the letters. Now, it happened in 2009. It was the 90th anniversary of the birth of Peter Keane, this artist who was my uncle in effect. I was with my stepmother in Switzerland when there was a phone call. The phone call was from a researcher trying to find me, and it got as far as phoning my stepmother. And I was sitting next to her and just passed the phone over. Now what she did, she took these 500 or so jumbled up letters and arranged them in chronological sequence and by writer. And I'd never have managed to do that. And but based on that, there's a large book was written with photographs and of paintings and so on of Peter Keane, the life of Peter Keane, on what would have been the 90th anniversary of his birth. So I was invited over to Terezin for the unveiling of that. And because afterwards we went out for dinner and it was very convivial, I missed the last bus back to Prague where my hotel was. And I had to stay the night in Terezin. Now, Terezin, as you've been there, you know, is a grim town. But the accommodation provided was in a place called the Magdeburg Barracks, which is the very building that my grandparents and aunt and uncle were locked up in for 2.5 years when they were there, and I was sleeping possibly in the same room for all I know.
How on earth did you feel?
I didn't sleep very well.
No.
But, I mean, I think of my grandparents as a benign presence. If they'd known me, they would have wanted good things for me rather than bad.
But what an experience.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, a memorable time in so many respects.
Yeah.
Gosh. Have you written that down also?
No.
Have you written
No, I
any
haven't.
autobiographical notes?
No, I mean, I just recall that. It was such a strange thing.
Indeed, and to bring you together, and yet in such unexpected circumstances like that. Very moving ones.
Yes, and as I say, I would like to go back there, possibly this summer, and revisit the town, knowing, what happened there, having filled in some of the gaps. But it's like also when I went to Vienna, or my wife and I went to Vienna a few years back. We were on an art appreciation trip, and whenever I walked around there, I felt like there were ghosts. I mean, not really. I don't believe in ghosts,
I
but
understand.
felt like ghosts because both my grandfather and my mother's uncle studied at the University of Vienna. So it was almost as if their presence was there in some weird way.
Yes. Did you feel that in Auschwitz also? Or was it just too horrific to feel that link?
No, I sort of got that sort of a whiff of that feeling. But I've also been more recently to the Imperial War Museum, where they've got a exhibition of Auschwitz, and they've got little figures there and so on, and that's the image I've got of the place as well. Anyway.
Is there anything else that you would like to add?
No, I'll probably think of things when you stop filming, but no.
Would you like to give a message to your family or for your friends?
Not particularly. I mean, that's not because I don't want to speak to them. I can't think of anything particularly specific to say to them. Hopefully this recording will amplify much more, and they can always ask me questions.
Or is there anything at all that you would like to say? Or
Could I just ask something? I was quite intrigued by what was the content of the letters? What were they regarding, and who were they from and to?
The contents, the letters were almost all written to my mother. And some of them from her mother, things, have you got your warm coat, and this is how you look after waterproofing your boots or some sort. Some of it is to reassure her, and to sympathise, because one of the letters, which I haven't seen, she sent to her mother, is obviously complaining about the work as a domestic, because my grandmother was reassuring her to say, I'm on your side, in effect. I don't know how anyone could treat you like this. Some of the most powerful ones were things like personal tragedies. Some woman who my mother knew gave way to despair and tried to kill herself and her young son, and only succeeded in killing her young son. And things like that. So it's all interspersed. Some of it's domestic, but others are real tragedies, or the plight of refugees. Or there's one from an aunt who survived Auschwitz, who wrote her a number of letters about the final days and what happened to my grandfather when he was in a train for 3 days waiting to be sent to Auschwitz, and how my aunt went with food for him every day because they were just in a cattle truck. So some of it's very, very powerful, and others is a bit banal. But it's all the time thinking, here's our young daughter a long way away on her own. I'm sure there was a feeling they didn't want to upset her and probably toned down how grim it was. But the letters stopped coming from her family once they were sent to Terezin in July 42. Until then, they'd come via her uncle's girlfriend in Switzerland as a neutral country. So there was a flow of letters in both directions. Yes. And then in July 42, they were sent to Terezin, and in October 44, they were murdered there in Auschwitz. And, the flow of information stopped. I know, actually, also thinking that it's one comment my mother made about Auschwitz is to be furious that when clearly the Germans had lost the war, October 44, the last transports from Terezin were sent, and her family were on about the last train or two. And she kept saying, they knew they were lost. Why did they have to do that? Yeah. Well, they never had to do it, of course, but... Have you got any more questions?
No, I was just reflecting that must have been very depressing for her, and lingered with her for the rest of her life.
Yes, I think it did. She mentioned that frequently. Yeah, they didn't have to do that. But
let's hope it doesn't happen again.
Well, except we know it does happen again in different guises in different countries. Yeah, let's hope.
On a positive note, if there's perhaps nothing more that you would like to add, or any further questions.
Actually, yes, sorry, just one more thing.
Absolutely.
Say, speak to the family and...
Please do. That would be tremendous.
No, I know, and it's part of my talk to say one thing that really gave my mother a lot of comfort in her later years was seeing her children growing up. We were long since grown up, seeing the grandchildren, and a feeling that her values had to some extent been carried forward to the next generations. And I've always thought of it as a bit like a vine, which grow in awful soil and very hard to kill off. And it's almost as if by the miracle my parents both escaped, raised a family, and now suddenly there are children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of theirs. So life carries on, and she was pleased, certainly. I think my father was, although it's harder to read. That there was the continuity, not just of people, but of values.
No, I think that's a very positive point to end on. Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed for so kindly agreeing to be interviewed on behalf of the AJR Refugee Voices project. Greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity. Karl Stransky, my mother's father in his early 20s in Czech Republic. Right. My father's grandmother, mother and uncle in about 1913 in Czech Republic. My mother's uncle Robert Freund in Vienna in about 1915. My mother Renee with her mother Marta Stransky in Prague in 1934. My father George and stepmother Gizi Morton in Switzerland in 1975. My wife Elaine and myself in London, December 1976. My parents George and Renee Morton in London in December 1976. My mother Renee Morton and me in California, 1985. My mother Renee Morton in London in 1998. My wife Elaine and myself with our 4 children in London in 2000.
And their names?
Their names being Susanna, Jonathan, Laura and Alex. Examples of letters sent to Renee Morton from her family during the war. Portrait of my grandmother Marta Stransky, painted by my aunt's husband Peter Keane in 1940.